2,000 years ago, when Jesus was walking the earth and had his own disciples, there was a phrase that was common from rabbis and other disciples to disciples. And the phrase was, "May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi." This might sound a little bit odd to us today because we aren't super familiar with the idea of rabbis and disciples, and we certainly don't encourage one another to get dusty outside of maybe some very niche circumstances. But for people in that culture 2,000 years ago, this was something that they would have heard on a fairly regular basis. A rabbi, if you're not familiar, is a Jewish teacher, is a religious leader who has accomplished a great deal, gone through a significant amount of formal schooling, and by the end of it, one of the main tests to become a rabbi was that you had to have memorized the entire, what we now know as the Old Testament of the Bible. Memorized. The whole thing. This was a big deal. Like I didn't have to memorize portions of the Bible to become a pastor. This was a huge deal. So, to become a rabbi was important. To be a disciple of a rabbi was the pathway toward that. And so as people would say to one another, "May you be covered in the dust of your rabbi," this was an image that was really important. It was significant. And it was deeply meaningful to the disciples that it was spoken to. And that image of following a teacher, of following a rabbi so closely that the dust from their shoes kicks up and covers you is really an image that under the hood was a driving force for this whole series. In fact, it's where this graphic came from. I wanted to give this image of being covered in dust because the reality is, as disciples of Jesus, that same thing that was said to disciples many thousands of years ago is something that I want for us. I want us to be covered in the dust of our rabbi, of Jesus. I want us to be following him so closely that we can't prevent ourselves from being covered in his dust. Now, this is a really important thing, and again, this whole series is really born out of this. I didn't cover this image or this idea last week because I kind of wanted to set the stage. I wanted to talk about something a little bit more foundational. But today and for the rest of the series, this is the image that I want you to have in mind as we talk about everything we're going to talk about. The goal of this whole series is that we would all become people that follow Jesus so closely, disciples that follow Jesus so closely that we're covered in the dust of him. And it's important because it is possible to be around Jesus without ever getting close enough to get dusty. When I was in college, after I had graduated from college, I traveled with the music and ministry team and played guitar and things. And the final summer after I graduated, I traveled one final time. And as that summer was coming to a close, I had a couple job interviews lined up. I was a youth ministry major in college, and I was going to be a youth pastor at a church, and I was also interested in doing some music stuff. So anyway, I had two interviews lined up. One at a church in Winfield, West Virginia, which was the hometown of who at the time was my best friend, now my wife, and the other was in Piqua, Ohio. And the reality is, on paper, there was no comparison. The Piqua job was actually tremendously better. Like, it was a large church. It had been a church that had been growing consistently for 20 years. They were about 700, 800 people at that point in time. On paper, absolute no-brainer. So I go to interview at the two places, and the one in West Virginia was kind of an interesting interview because the pastor who was there, it was a small church, about 100 people, 80, 100 people, and he was 64, and he was retiring. And he knew he was retiring in like a year, and he was like, I need to get somebody in here, but I'm leaving. That's not a great way to sell your job. So he goes through this. I go to Piqua. I'm interviewing with them. It's, again, beautiful, incredible building, nice facilities, big budget. They want to hire me. The guy's like, "Hey, we want you to be the youth pastor. I also want you to help lead our music teams. And by the way, we go to Reds games all the time." And I was like, "For real? This is great. This is the best." But there was a major problem. When this guy talked, he spit everywhere. And I don't mean a little bit. I mean a lot. Like enough that I'm sitting at the table legitimately uncomfortable about what's happening. The whole time in my head thinking, this job is amazing, but I don't know that I can do this. Okay? He wasn't spitting on me. He was just like spitting on himself and on the table. But it was like a lot. I left that interview and I remember calling my parents and being like, they're like, hey, how'd the interview go? I was like, this job is amazing. It is perfect, but I don't know that I can work for this guy. They were like, why not? I was like, he spits. I've never in my life encountered anyone else like this, truly, ever. It was I was in the interview, I'm having these conversations with myself, like, how in the world has this guy grown a big church? Because if I was sitting there and he's spitting I don't understand. It was so awkward. And in the end, honest to goodness, I made the decision to go to Winfield because I couldn't imagine working every day with a guy who spit everywhere like that. Here's why I tell you that story. Because I was forced with a choice of whether or not I was going to follow this person who did this thing that I wasn't sure I wanted to be around. And the truth is that I could have said, yes, I want to take this job, and I could have worked for him, and it could have been an amazing thing, and I don't know. It could have been great. He had a staff of 6 or 8 people at the time, and they were fine. Maybe I would have been fine. But in the end, I had to make the decision, I'm going to go a different direction because I don't know that I can actually walk closely enough with this guy and feel comfortable about it. The truth is, when it comes to our relationship with Christ, I think that a lot of us have encountered Jesus, but we don't want to walk too closely with him because we don't want to get dirty. We follow Jesus closely enough that it's comfortable for us, closely enough that we can see where he's going, closely enough that maybe we can hear the things that he's saying if we strain, but not so closely that we're covered in his dust. So we're okay with things like, I'll attend church services and I'll agree mostly with what Jesus says and I'll admire him and I'll be familiar with him, but ultimately I don't want to get dirty. I don't want to take the risk that he's going to start leading me somewhere down a road that I don't want to walk down. I don't want to be walking so closely with him that I might miss out on this thing or that thing because I can't even see them because I'm in this cloud of dust. And ultimately, I don't really want to have to shower after I get done walking with him, But in truth, we only need a shower when we're covered in dust, and dust only settles on people who are walking behind someone. And if there's no dust on us, it's worth at least asking, am I following Jesus or am I just watching him from afar? And so if we want to be his disciples, if we want to be people who are covered in his dust, then we need to look at his disciples, how close they walked to him to be covered in his dust. So I'm going to look at 2 stories today, one from the book of John. And this particular story, the first one, is it's very early in the process of Jesus' disciples following him. We don't know exactly how many at this point he has called, if all 12 are walking with him or if it's a smaller subset, because the Bible doesn't tell us every single time that he called someone, but there are at least a handful at this point who are kind of officially his disciples. John chapter 2, we find this written. On the 3rd day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there. Pause. I've said this many, many times, but in case you haven't been here when I've said it, I just want to point out that anytime you see a detail like that interjected into a biblical narrative, it's there for a reason. That's an odd detail. There were probably a lot of people there. It was a wedding. If there weren't a lot of people there, it would have been weird. Probably a lot of people there. But the text specifically says Jesus' mother was there. It's important. It's going to come into play in just a moment. Jesus' mother was there. And Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." Jesus' response, "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now pause again. I'm just going to throw this out. If my mom gave me some information and I said to her, "Woman, why do you involve me?" that would not be how she responded. She wouldn't be like, "Hey, just do whatever he says." We'd have a talk. One of those talks that as an adult parent you have with your kids. You can't punish them, but you're going to have a talk. You know what I mean? Okay, let's not do this again. "Woman, why do you involve me? My hour has not yet come. What's Jesus saying? What he's saying is very simply, he's saying, I'm going to do some awesome stuff, but it's just not time for it yet. But Jesus' mother's response, and again, to return to what I said a moment ago, the detail that his mother was there is important. John wrote this narrative not to talk about, I don't think fundamentally to talk about what Jesus did, although what we're going to see Jesus does is amazing. I think John wrote this narrative to show us something important about what it looks like to follow Jesus. He's emphasizing Jesus' mother. Jesus' mother says, do whatever he tells you. Now, maybe your mothers thought you walked on water. Mine did not, and mine does not. For those of you that know Carol, who I think is in the nursery right now, she has never been shy about telling me what she thinks, and she has never blown smoke toward me, ever. She is truthful and honest to a fault. I can't fathom what it would take for my mother to look at someone and say, hey, do whatever he says. I can't fathom it. But Jesus' mother does. Why? Well, at this point, Jesus was about 30 years old. Something happened. Some things happened. From Jesus' birth to the time that he was 30, that would have indicated to his mom that he was completely trustworthy. Now, it probably started when an angel showed up and said to her, hey, you're going to have a kid. And I know you haven't even been married yet. I know you haven't consummated the marriage, but you're going to have a baby, and it's going to be God's son. That probably would set you up to see things a bit differently with this child, right? But even so, Mary at this stage in time trusts Jesus so implicitly as a 30-year-old young man that she is saying to these servants in this house, do anything he says. That's important. So as we continue, we see what Jesus did. Nearby, there stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. So these are big jars. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars up with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet. Pause again. This is a stupid thing for Jesus to tell them to do. Let's not over-romanticize the Bible for a moment. These are real people interacting with a person. I mean, they clearly know Jesus. Jesus has been invited to the party, to the wedding. But he says, go fill up the jars with water, bring them back, and then dip water out and take it into the ceremony. This would have been culturally a terrible thing to do. But they're servants, and Jesus is commanding it, so they do. They did so. And the master of the banquet tasted the water that had now been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside, and he said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, the best of the best. And then they bring out the bad stuff after everybody's already had too much to drink. But you flipped it. You saved the best till right now. At which point I can only imagine the bridegroom's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I did not. But notice, John immediately flips it. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. And then look at the last thing he says. And his disciples believed in him. This is the first recorded miracle that we have that Jesus performs. The very first one. John sets the whole thing up through this lens of Jesus doesn't tell the disciples to do anything. He tells servants to do something. Servants who had to obey him. He demonstrates that Jesus' mother trusted Jesus so implicitly that she says to the servants, just do anything he says. Whatever he says, do it. The implication being, I don't really know what my boy is going to be up to here, but I know it's going to work out. So they do. And in this moment, they fill up jars with water, which is water. They know it's water. They fill it up. They dip it out. They take it in. It becomes wine, not just wine, but it becomes the best wine of the day. And in the end, the way John wraps the story is by saying, and his disciples believed in him. Why? I think John says this because this whole story John has been using it, again, John being one of his disciples, by the way. John was there that day. Jesus is doing something critical. He is inviting the disciples to have the same posture his mother did. He's inviting his disciples to see someone who has walked with him for many, many years. He's inviting the disciples to see the way his mother responds to him and forces them to be confronted with the question, will I do something that crazy? Because, and listen, I'm going to read between the lines here, but I'm confident when I say this. If I was one of the disciples there that day and Jesus said, hey, go fill up the jars with water, I'd be muttering I'd be like, what's he doing? We can't take water out there. But to us, that may not seem like a big deal. To be clear, it would have been tremendously embarrassing for the hosts of the wedding to bring out water at their ceremony. It would have been a culturally shameful thing to do. So if I'm the disciples, I'm like, what's he doing? He's going to bring shame on these people. Can you? Dude, his mom said do whatever. I mean, my mom would be like, don't do anything he says to you. His mom said do anything. Like, there's got to be something happening here. And then the wine comes out, and it had to have been this moment where for those disciples that day, they would have been like, what is happening? This guy's different. They would have left that day and they would have gone back and they probably wouldn't have slept that night and they'd have been thinking like, no wonder his mom said to do whatever. That's crazy. Nobody should have done what he said, but they did. And then this thing happened and who is this man? The disciples believed in him. See, what Jesus knew, what Jesus was doing was critical. It was foundational. He was inviting the disciples to have the same posture his mother did. He was inviting them to confront the question, will there be anything that he says that I won't trust? Will I do the crazy thing he asks when he asks me? See, nothing was too crazy for Jesus' mother. That's why she said, do whatever. She didn't give caveats. She didn't give conditions. She said, do whatever, because she knew that Jesus was trustworthy. And Jesus knew, what Jesus knew that day was that the disciples needed to settle something. They needed to understand that following Jesus closely requires trusting Jesus radically. Following Jesus closely requires trusting Jesus radically. Jesus' mother trusted him radically. She trusted him in a way that made no sense. And for the disciples that day, they had to confront the question, will I trust him the same way? Because I don't know if I would have done that. But he told the servants to, and his mom said, do it. And so they did. Like, will I? What am I going to do when Jesus asks me the crazy thing? We can't follow closely enough to be covered in dust if we only follow Jesus when where he goes makes sense to us. Because Jesus is going to turn down some crazy roads. He's going to tell us to do some crazy things. He's going to say things to us. He's going to ask things of us that on the surface we're like, what? We're saying to our friend, like, I feel like Jesus is saying this thing to me, but like, this doesn't make any sense at all. It makes none. Will I do the crazy thing? Because I can't be covered in Jesus' dust if I only go where it makes sense to me. And that's the key, trust. Trust is the key to the whole thing. In this moment, the disciples don't fully understand Jesus. They don't. It's very obvious as you continue through the biblical narratives that at this moment, the disciples trust this guy, but they don't completely trust him. It's a little bit like, when you get married, you love your spouse, but then if your marriage is good over time, you love your spouse more. It's true that you love them when you married them, but it's also true that you love them more, right? Trust is the same way. And what Jesus understands is that he's called these young men to follow him, and they have chosen to trust him because ultimately trust is a choice. But he also knows that they don't trust him fully. Because there's this aspect of trust where we choose it, and then there's also this aspect of trust where once somebody proves that the trust we've placed in them is legitimate, over and over and over and over throughout time, we can get to a place where we trust them completely, just like Jesus' mother did. So the disciples at this moment in time don't trust Jesus fully, but they trust him enough that they keep walking with him. They kept being covered in his dust, and that leads them to a place that they didn't see coming. So we're going to jump to Mark chapter 8. And as we do, the Bible is such an interesting book. There's actually several kind of smaller stories that lead into Mark chapter 8. And Mark chapter 8 on its own is an incredible chapter. It's meaningful. I've preached from it before several times here. But what leads into it actually gives it a much more full meaning. It's more robust. It's powerful. So the context is that in Mark chapter 7 and in Mark chapter 8 before this, there are several stories in a row where Jesus is emphasizing how people aren't seeing clearly. They're spiritually blind. And in a couple cases, it's the disciples themselves. And so leading into Mark chapter 8, Mark, who again, one of the disciples, would have been present in these conversations. He was at the events. Mark is trying to demonstrate through the way that he organizes these narratives that we can be following Jesus but not actually see what Jesus is doing. We can be following Jesus but be so distracted by other things or just not get it because he's operating in such a different way than we are. And as these things happen and as Jesus emphasizes how these people don't see, he makes a move. There's a switch that happens. And what Mark says is that there's this conversation that happens. And it happens between Jesus and his disciples. They've been present for all these you don't see clearly conversations. And then in this moment, Jesus pulls them all aside and he says, hey, who does everybody say I am? What are people saying about me? And they say, well, some say this and some say that. And then Jesus pauses and he says, well, what about you? Who do you say that I am? And Peter, in typical Peter fashion, jumps right in and he says, you are the Messiah. And it's at that moment that Jesus brings he brings this whole thing home. Because all along, there's only been one thing Jesus was after. And he knows that he has to get the disciples to the point where they believe completely in him. They believe he is who he says he is. They believe he's the Messiah, that he's the Son of God, that he's the Savior of the world, that he's the King of Kings. All these things Jesus knows they have to have that settled. They chose to trust him by following him, that they have continued to follow him. Now they trust him more. They've gotten to the place where they believe that he is the Son of God. And as soon as Peter confesses it, Jesus makes his move. And this is what we find in Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 31. It says, he then, meaning as soon as Peter says this, he then began to teach them. He began to teach them that the Son of Man, which is the way Jesus referred to himself, must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. In other words, Peter is hearing these things Jesus is saying, and then he says, no, this can't happen. Mark doesn't record what Peter says, but I believe it's Matthew does. Mark says, no, this can't happen. You can't be killed. And Jesus, in one of the strongest and most challenging moments in the Gospels, says to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. I can't emphasize how strong this is enough. This is Jesus' closest follower. He is Jesus' best friend on this earth. And that is what Jesus says to him in this moment. And he says it, and on the surface, it's easy to read it and be like, man, that was really, really harsh. Like Peter's just trying to defend his friend. But what Jesus immediately says, or what Jesus immediately does and says after, helps us understand why Jesus does not mince words. So continuing in verse 34, then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples. And he says, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes to his Father's glory with the holy angels. Now, this is strong too, but Jesus explains it clearly. All through these narratives, Mark is setting something up, and it started all the way back at the wedding in Cana that John described. When Jesus called the disciples, they chose to put their trust in him, but Jesus knew he had to develop their trust. He had to grow it until they believed he was the Messiah, the Son of God, the Savior of the world. And as soon as they confess it, Jesus says, okay, here's what's going to happen. You guys are following me now, but you've only understood part. What's going to happen now is that soon I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to suffer, I'm going to die. It's necessary. It must happen. And if you truly want to be my disciples, if you truly believe that I am who you say I am, then you've got to be willing to follow me there, not just down these dusty roads all around us. You've got to be willing to give up your very life. You've given up everything so far, but this is the biggest ask that I've made yet. You have to be willing to keep nothing back. You have to be willing to give everything for my sake. See, the one thing Jesus was always after, it wasn't their obedience, it wasn't their words, it wasn't their tithe, it wasn't their attendance, it wasn't all the things that we attach to religion sometimes. What Jesus was after was their souls. It was the very inner part of them. Because Jesus didn't invite the disciples to be his disciples just so he could spend 3 years with them on this earth. He invited them to be his disciples so that he could be with them forever. And so that they could begin the movement that would redeem the whole world for God. But Jesus knew that if they weren't willing to follow him down every dusty road, including the road to the cross, they could never accomplish what they needed to accomplish. They never would, because no one would want to walk that road. And so what Jesus says to the disciples in this moment and to the crowd that day, and I believe if we're going to think about what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus? Well, when Jesus calls us, we follow. That was last week, or we answer. And then when Jesus walks, we follow him. Well, that sounds nice on paper, until we realize that the road Jesus walked was a road to a Roman cross that cost him his life, that sent him to the gates of hell so that he could be the redemption for us. And so what Jesus says to the crowd that day, what he says to us, what it truly means at its fundamental core to be a disciple, if we're going to be covered in the dust of our rabbi, you must lose your life. That is what it is to be a disciple of the King of Kings. That's what it is to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. It is to lose your life. That's what he says that day. Now, to be clear, this is what Jesus was always leading the disciples toward. And as Jesus says this, Jesus often spoke in hyperbole. But that hyperbole illustrates truth. And there are times where what Jesus says is literally true. There are other times where it's not. But it illustrates truth. In this case, several of the disciples did end up giving up their lives. They lost their lives for the sake of Jesus. Several of the disciples were martyred. Peter was crucified in Rome upside down. Not all of them died that way. Some of them died old men, having lived a good but hard life. John, who wrote the Gospel of John, became a pastor, led a congregation, and died an old man, as far as we know, not having been a martyr. So when Jesus says lose your life, he doesn't literally mean every one of us in this room is going to be killed for our faith. But the question is, are you willing to be, if that is what Jesus asked? Are you willing to be, if that's the road he walked down and said, will you follow me? Or do you want to stand at the crossroad here and wait and watch me in the distance while I go through this and you don't have to? Are you going to follow me down the road and be covered in my dust? Or are you going to stand back and wait because you don't want to have to take a shower afterward? To lose your life doesn't mean to destroy it. It means to stop gripping it so tightly in a desire to stay clean. It means choosing to count the cost and to drop your nets like we talked about last week and begin the process of following Jesus wherever he leads. And it means settling in your soul now, will I continue to walk with him when the road he walks down doesn't make sense to me? So maybe the question isn't, am I doing enough for Jesus? Because so often in church circles, and so often when we talk about discipleship, we think about, am I doing enough? Am I doing enough of the right things? Am I avoiding enough of the bad things? Am I doing enough? But I don't believe that that's the way Jesus thought about discipleship much at all. I believe the question is a lot simpler and a lot harder. The question is, am I walking closely enough to Jesus to be changed by Jesus? Because for the disciples that day in Cana, if they weren't there, they wouldn't have been changed. If they hadn't seen what Jesus did, they wouldn't have been changed by him. It says it right there in the text. And the disciples believed in him. If the disciples weren't there that day, if they hadn't followed Jesus down the dusty road that led to the banquet hall in Cana, they wouldn't have been changed. If the disciples hadn't then continued to follow him day after day after day, closely enough that they were covered in his dust, on this day, when he says to them to follow me, you must lose your life. And by the way, when you lose your life, you actually gain everything. If they hadn't been there that day, they wouldn't have heard the words he said. They couldn't have been changed by his words because they would not have heard this word. They would not have heard his words. To lose your life doesn't mean to destroy it. It means to follow him closely enough to be changed by him. Imagine a church full of people who don't just agree with Jesus, who don't just feel better about their lives because they're doing religious things, but imagine a group of people who truly are walking so closely with the Master, with the King of Kings, with the Rabbi, that they're covered in his dust. Unwilling to turn to the right or to the left unless he does so first. Unwilling to stop walking because, well, what Jesus is leading to doesn't actually make any sense. But confident and bold, knowing wherever the Master leads, wherever the Rabbi goes, that's the best road. Trusting him enough to say to those around us, hey, do whatever he says. That is what it is to be a disciple of Jesus. Not to hold so tightly to our opinions, our thoughts, our goals, our desires, that when Jesus asks for something that contradicts them, we doubt, but rather to trust him so implicitly, so completely that no matter what he asks, no matter when he asks, our response is, yes, Lord. You have proven yourself through the generations. You have proven yourself to me. I will do what you say because I trust you with all that I am. May we be the kind of people who are unmistakably covered in the dust of our Rabbi. Let me pray for us today.